The morning air hangs heavy over a field in the American South, a mist of pale gray rolling low across the earth. Crickets fade into silence as the first streaks of light push over the horizon. A faint cry drifts on the breeze, so soft it could be the wind, yet unmistakably human. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a child wails, and then another joins, their voices echoing through the damp stillness. The camera of your mind moves closer, through dew-wet grass and the skeletal remains of a wooden fence. What you find is not a scene from a nightmare, but a fragment of American history that rarely reaches the pages of a textbook. In the early 1800s, newspaper ads carried lines as cold as they were calculated. For sale, a young woman, proven breeder, healthy and strong. These words were not a metaphor, they were commerce, an accounting of flesh, fertility and profit. Enslaved women and men were reduced to numbers, to breeding stock. Their bodies treated as the next harvest. Imagine a man named Isaac, broad-shouldered and silent, standing in the corner of a drafty wooden cabin. He is no more than 25, but the furrows in his brow read older. His life is measured not by the passing of years, but by the children he has fathered. Children torn from him and sold to strangers. He knows none of their names now. Beside him, Sarah, a woman with eyes the color of storm clouds, holds her breath. She's been forced to bear 3 children already, each sold before their second birthday. She is 21. Tonight, the overseer will call them both again. The ground beneath their feet is soaked with generations of silence. Isaac and Sarah never chose each other, never courted, never dreamed of building a family. Their names might be lost to history, but their suffering built fortunes. From Maryland's tobacco fields to the cotton empires of the Deep South, people like them were herded, paired and monitored as if they were livestock. This is not a story about the distant past alone. It is a reckoning with a hidden economy that thrived after the United States officially banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808. Demand for labor did not shrink. It swelled, and where ships could no longer sail, a cruel domestic trade took root, one that relied on the forced reproduction of human beings. Listen closely as the morning light sharpens across that quiet field. The cries of children you imagined are not echoes from nowhere. They are history pressing through time. The wealth of banks, merchants and landowners swelled on the backs of mothers who were never allowed to mother, fathers who were never allowed to protect, and children who were born only to be sold, tonight, tomorrow, and for decades. Men like Isaac and women like Sarah endured a cycle designed to keep them silent. Yet they resisted, in whispered plans of escape, in the refusal to forget each other's names, in the simple act of surviving. You are about to enter a chapter of American history that few dare to teach. What you will hear is not folklore or exaggeration, but the documented machinery of profit and power. It is a truth that lives beneath the soil, a truth we must unearth. The year is 1808, and the Atlantic Ocean no longer carries slave ships into American ports, at least not legally. The United States has outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans, a decision celebrated by politicians as a moral step forward. Yet as one door closes, another swings wide. Across the southern states, planters and merchants begin to calculate a new future. If they can no longer buy people from across the sea, they will make more of them at home. Imagine standing in a crowded Virginia courthouse as news of the federal ban spreads. Tobacco planters murmur to one another, a mix of anxiety and opportunity flickering across their faces. Among them might be Colonel Nathaniel Byrd, a fictional composite of many real men, wealthy, ambitious, and ruthlessly pragmatic. He runs numbers on a scrap of paper. The market value of a healthy male field hand, the potential profit from selling a child born into bondage, the cost of food and shelter. His pencil scratches faster when he realizes the arithmetic favors growth, not decline. The domestic slave trade, he predicts, will not shrink. It will boom. Across the Atlantic states, this calculation becomes a quiet creed. Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, already rich in enslaved populations, transform into breeding centers. Enslaved men and women, counted like livestock, become the raw material for an interstate trade that will move hundreds of thousands southward to the new cotton frontier. Cotton itself has just found a perfect partner in Eli Whitney's gin, and the Mississippi Delta promises untold riches. Demand for labor soars. Travel south to a bustling market in Richmond or Baltimore in 1815. The scent of sweat and damp wood hangs heavy as traders bark prices. Young women are examined with the clinical gaze of butchers selecting prime cuts. Children cling to their mother's skirts until pulled away by a buyer's hand. Every sale is legal. Every heartbeat is money. Behind these markets stands an invisible network of bankers, insurers, and shipping agents. Northern financiers extend credit lines to southern traders, knowing that enslaved bodies are collateral as solid as any brick building. Insurance companies underwrite the lives of enslaved people against illness and death. Newspapers print ads without hesitation. Likely young woman, excellent breeder, for sale. The system feeds itself. Families like the Birds, or the real-life Carters, Balls, and Taylors of Virginia find they can profit more by selling people than by selling tobacco. Plantations that once harvested crops now harvest human births. Overseers keep records not only of work hours, but of menstrual cycles, pairing women and men for maximum fertility. A man's worth may be tallied by the number of children he fathers, a woman's by the number she bears. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., lawmakers congratulate themselves on the end of the international trade. Few care to admit that slavery's core, the buying and selling of human lives, has only tightened its grip. Some northern newspapers run editorials condemning the hypocrisy, but the southern economy roars too loudly to be ignored. The young republic, barely 3 decades old, is already bound to the profits of perpetual bondage. Picture an enslaved family, let's call them the Johnsons, living on a Virginia plantation during this pivot. Samuel Johnson is strong and quiet, skilled with horses. His wife, Rebecca, is known for her resilience. They have 2 children, Anna and Elijah. Samuel dreams of buying freedom one day, perhaps through extra work or a sympathetic owner. But after 1808, his owner's attitude changes. Samuel notices the overseer watching Rebecca more closely, speaking in hushed tones about her fine health. When their 3rd child is born, a trader arrives within weeks. The baby is sold before Samuel can hold her for long. For the owner, it is a simple matter of economics. For Samuel and Rebecca, it is an unending grief. By the 1820s, this pattern repeats across the Upper South. Thousands of families like the Johnsons are torn apart, their children shipped to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The law that was meant to curb the slave trade instead fuels an internal one, vast and brutal. The nation tells itself comforting lies, that enslaved people are naturally prolific, that sales are necessary for economic stability, that families will adapt. But the truth is written in ledgers and auction posters. Forced reproduction, strategic separation, and the relentless pursuit of profit. This is the stage on which the breeding farms will rise. The import ban was never a true limit on slavery. It was the spark that ignited an even more insidious commerce, one built on American soil and American denial. In the world of the early 19th century American South, every heartbeat could be converted into a ledger entry. After the 1808 ban on importing enslaved Africans, planters and traders began to see the human body not merely as a worker, but as a renewable asset, a source of compound interest in flesh and blood. To understand the next phase of this hidden economy, you have to think like the men who built it, with cold arithmetic. Imagine the auction block in Richmond around 1825. A healthy young man sells for roughly $1,000. A woman of childbearing age, perhaps a little less, yet a single child born to that woman, fed, clothed, and raised to the age of 10, might fetch $400 or more. For a planter who already owns the mother, every child represents pure profit, minus the meager costs of food and shelter. A woman who gives birth to 6 or 7 children over her lifetime could generate several $1,000s, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands today. To traders and financiers, a fertile woman was the closest thing to a money tree. Men like Colonel Nathaniel Byrd, our composite planter from Virginia, kept meticulous records. His plantation ledger listed not only names and work assignments, but fertility notes, dates of births, spacing between pregnancies, health conditions of mothers. Overseers watched for the first signs of puberty among girls and reported them with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for crop yields. A drop in birth rates was treated like a blight on the tobacco fields, prompting new pairings or harsher discipline. Bankers and insurance agents quietly underwrote this grisly calculus. In New York and Boston, firms extended credit lines to Southern traders, confident that a rising population of enslaved children guaranteed repayment. Policies insured enslaved people against illness or death, turning human lives into collateral. Merchants advanced money for breeding stock, the term some documents used without shame. Profits flowed north as well as south, binding the entire nation to the arithmetic of reproduction. Consider a fictional but typical trader, Edward Harlan, who travels between Maryland and Louisiana. Harlan's small caravan of wagons carries shackles, ledgers, and contracts rather than crops. He buys young women from Virginia planters at a premium, knowing their fertility will double his investment once they are sold to cotton planters in Mississippi. Harlan's letters to his partners, modeled after real correspondence preserved in archives, speak of fine prospects and sound breeding stock, never of people or families. Each birth in Louisiana means a new payday for men like him. Enslaved men were measured in the same ruthless terms. A strong field hand who fathered many children increased the value of every woman he impregnated. Some were coerced with threats. Others promised small privileges, a rare chance to avoid the whip. But even those who complied were prisoners of the system, their identities reduced to the crude label of stud. Plantation ledgers sometimes recorded the number of offspring next to a man's name, like a tally of livestock. Meanwhile, the northern press, when it mentioned these practices at all, often cloaked them in euphemisms: natural increase, domestic supply. Only a few abolitionist writers spoke plainly. In 1839, activist Theodore Weld described systematic degradation and calculated breeding, warning that the nation's wealth was literally multiplying through forced conception. His words were dismissed by many as exaggeration, yet plantation accounts and insurance records told the same story in numbers and dollars. Think again of Samuel and Rebecca Johnson, the fictional Virginia couple introduced earlier. By 1830, Rebecca has borne 6 children. 2 were sold before their first birthdays. 3 others were marched south by traders like Harlan. 1 remains on the plantation but is already being eyed by buyers. Samuel's value to the owner rises with every child he sires. The overseer notes in the ledger, Johnson, productive. No mention of the grief that hollows their lives. This economy did more than enrich individual planters, it reshaped entire states. Virginia's population of enslaved people became a reservoir for the booming cotton South. Counties once known for tobacco shifted their focus to human reproduction. Farmers who once worried about soil depletion now counted profits in infants. The phrase, "sold down the river," entered common speech. A quiet acknowledgement of the constant flow of children torn from parents and sent to Mississippi and Louisiana. By the eve of the Civil War, historians estimate that well over 1 million people had been transported through this internal trade, their births tracked and monetized with relentless precision. The United States prided itself on modern capitalism, and here it was in its starkest form: bodies as balance sheets, families as investment portfolios. These are the cold mathematics of human breeding, numbers that built mansions in Richmond, financed banks in New York, and lined the pockets of traders who saw no difference between a newborn child and a bale of cotton. Behind every figure in those ledgers was a life like Samuel's or Rebecca's, measured in dollars, but lived in anguish. The road to the farm is little more than a muddy track, framed by thick stands of pine that blot out the rising sun. At its end stands a cluster of weathered buildings surrounded by a crude wooden fence. From a distance it could pass for any plantation, but a closer look reveals something different. There are no wide cotton fields here, no sprawling rows of tobacco. This place is built for people, not crops, a site designed to manufacture lives. The main house sits on a slight rise, whitewashed but peeling, a silent symbol of its owner's prosperity. Below it stretch a series of long, low cabins. Each cabin is divided into small, windowless rooms, their doors secured with iron latches. The smell of damp wood and sweat clings to every surface. Inside, straw mattresses are laid in neat rows. A single lantern hangs from a beam, throwing weak light on the faces of those who live here. Meet Rachel, a young woman of 20, her hair wrapped in a faded cloth. She rocks a baby on her lap, the child only weeks old. She knows she will not be allowed to keep him for long. The overseer has already made a note in the ledger. Male infant, strong, for future sale. Rachel has seen this before 3 times now. Each time she hears a wagon approach, her chest tightens. She knows what comes next. Across the yard, another cabin holds men like Thomas, tall and muscular, his wrists marked by old scars. Thomas has been forced into pairings with multiple women, a practice overseers call encouragement. He is quiet, withdrawn, aware that refusal brings the whip. He thinks often of a wife he once had on a different plantation, sold south years ago. He wonders if she still lives, if their child survived. The farm's owner considers him valuable not for his skill with a plow, but for the children he fathers. Each morning begins before dawn. A bell clanks in the yard, summoning everyone outside. The overseer, a hard-faced man named Merrick, records the previous night's production in a thick book. He notes pregnancies, births, and any incidents of illness. His voice is flat, businesslike. To him, these are not people but entries in a breeding program. When a woman nears the end of her pregnancy, Merrick assigns another enslaved woman to watch over her, not out of kindness, but to ensure the child survives. The owner. Mr. Alton in this composite portrait appears rarely, but his presence shapes every hour. He arrives on horseback, inspecting the cabins with the eye of a livestock dealer. He speaks in low tones with Merrick about schedules and profitability. 3 more births this season, he mutters, running a hand along the polished wood of the ledger. He has investments waiting in New Orleans, buyers eager for strong young bodies. A newborn here means a payday there. Life inside the cabins follows a cruel rhythm. Women are paired with men chosen for strength or health. Some couples are forced together for weeks at a time. Privacy is non-existent. The overseer's footsteps can be heard outside at all hours. When children are born, they are weaned quickly so their mothers can return to the cycle. Babies are often taken by the age of 2, sold to plantations hundreds of miles away. The sound of a wagon departing becomes a sound of dread. Despite the suffocating control, small acts of resistance flicker in the dark. Rachel hums old songs from her childhood, a melody of comfort for her baby and a quiet assertion of identity. Thomas teaches the older children to carve small wooden animals, a way to remember their humanity. Some women secretly use herbs in desperate attempts to prevent pregnancy. Others whisper plans of escape, though the surrounding woods and armed patrols make it nearly impossible. The farm's cruelty is not hidden. Neighbors know. Local traders visit regularly, inspecting the children, bargaining over prices. Doctors employed by the owner check the health of pregnant women with clinical detachment, offering advice to improve yield. In letters, the owner boasts of his natural increase, the term planters use to describe the growing population of enslaved people. He never mentions the sorrow carved into every face. At night, when the cabins finally fall silent, the weight of the day settles. Rachel holds her child tighter, aware that each sunrise could bring separation. Thomas sits alone near the doorway, staring at the moon. He thinks of running, but knows the dogs and patrols make it a death sentence. Instead, he whispers a prayer to a God he hopes still listens. This breeding farm, like many across the Upper South, functions as an engine of profit. It requires no fields to till, no crops to harvest, only the endless reproduction of human beings. Every birth adds value to ledgers in Richmond, New Orleans, and New York. The system thrives on silence, on the complicity of neighbors and the distance of lawmakers who prefer not to look too closely. As you step back from this grim scene, remember that it is not an isolated nightmare but part of a vast network. Farms like this one supplied the plantations of the Deep South, feeding an economy that stretched from cotton fields to northern banks. The cries of children in these cabins echo through centuries, a reminder of lives treated as capital. Night settles heavy over the cabins, but within the darkness, a quiet strength endures. The women of the breeding farms carry that strength like a hidden flame, passing it from mother to daughter, friend to friend. Their voices rarely reach newspapers or court records, yet fragments survive in oral histories and the memories of descendants. Through them, we can glimpse the resistance that lived beneath the surface of relentless oppression. Picture Rachel again, the young mother whose infant was already marked for sale. By day she works under the overseer's watchful eye, her movements measured, her emotions concealed. But in the still hours after the lanterns are extinguished, she hums lullabies from the coast of West Africa, songs her own mother once sang. Each note carries a coded message: you are more than property. You belong to a lineage older than these fences. The overseer hears only a tune. Her child hears survival. Other women wield resistance more directly. Some learn the uses of native herbs, passing down recipes for teas and powders that might delay or prevent pregnancy. To the men who own them, these women are supposed to be breeders, but they know their bodies are their last realm of control. A few risk severe punishment by using these remedies, choosing the danger of discovery over the certainty of another child sold away. Their defiance is quiet but calculated, a refusal to let their wombs be instruments of profit. In rare, desperate moments, some women resort to actions that history struggles to name. The decision to end a pregnancy or even a newborn's life rather than allow a child to be enslaved. Enslavers recorded such tragedies as accidents or losses, but within the community, these acts were understood as final, heart-wrenching forms of rebellion. The choice is unthinkable, yet it speaks to the impossible reality these women faced. There were other paths of resistance too. Escape remained a dangerous hope, but stories circulate of women who fled despite patrols and dogs. One remembered figure is Harriet Jacobs, whose life, though not on a breeding farm, mirrored many of these struggles. Jacobs hid for nearly 7 years in a cramped attic before finally gaining freedom, leaving behind a detailed narrative of sexual exploitation and the fierce desire to protect her children. Her words stand as testimony for countless others who never had the chance to write. On these farms, solidarity became a lifeline. Older women taught the young how to survive childbirth with limited resources, how to heal wounds with poultices made from roots and leaves. They created networks of care, watching over each other's children when mothers were forced into labor or into the overseer's cabin. Around the communal fires they shared stories from Africa, whispered prayers in secret languages, and planned small acts of defiance, delaying work, hiding tools, or sending coded messages to loved ones on distant plantations. Some women used the very system meant to oppress them as a shield. They bargained for the safety of their children by promising obedience or feigned illness to buy time. A few negotiated with sympathetic whites, poor neighbors, midwives, or itinerant preachers to pass letters or provide information about escape routes. Every bargain carried risk, yet each was an assertion of agency in a world determined to strip them of it. Consider the inner world of someone like Rachel when the trader's wagon finally arrives. She wraps her child in the only cloth she owns, pressing her face to his for a final breath of his scent. Tears threaten but do not fall. She knows that showing grief might invite punishment or hasten the separation. Instead, she whispers his name over and over, imprinting it in her memory like a prayer, a vow that no matter where he is taken, someone will remember who he is. These acts of remembrance were themselves a weapon against erasure. Names, songs, and stories became living archives carried across generations. When descendants recounted family histories a century later, those fragments reassembled a truth that enslavers had tried to bury. The oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reveal this endurance. Elderly women speaking of mothers who risked everything to keep a child's name alive. Even within captivity, moments of love bloomed. Secret marriages took place in the shadows of the cabins, vows exchanged without the sanction of law, but with profound spiritual weight. Mothers taught their children dignity, telling them they were God's children, not the master's property. Such lessons formed the bedrock of cultural survival, sustaining communities long after the physical chains were broken. The women of the breeding farms were not passive victims of history. They were strategists, healers, protectors, and sometimes warriors of the spirit. Their courage did not always look like open revolt. Often it was the quiet persistence of life itself. Each song, each hidden herb, each whispered name was a declaration. We are more than the sum of your ledgers. As the night deepens around those cabins, their voices linger, soft but unyielding, an unbroken thread through centuries of struggle and remembrance. Before dawn, the men are already awake. The overseer's whistle hasn't sounded yet, but the weight of expectation presses on them like the humid night air. They know what the day may demand, labor in the fields, yes, but also something far more intimate and dehumanizing. On the breeding farms of the Upper South, enslaved men were forced into a role the enslavers called studs, a term borrowed from animal husbandry. Their humanity was deliberately erased so their bodies could be treated as tools of reproduction. Imagine a man like Isaac, broad-shouldered from years of back-breaking work. To the traders and planters, he is worth more than an ordinary field hand because of his strength and fertility. Isaac has no say when the overseer orders him to the cabins of specific women. He's given no choice about whom he will touch, no regard for the women's feelings or his own. The act is a command, not a relationship. If he hesitates, there are whips and shackles waiting. If he complies, he carries the shame of complicity, though the true violence belongs to those who orchestrate it. This coercion tears at every layer of identity. Men raised to cherish family bonds are forced to violate them. Husbands watch as their wives are paired with others. Fathers know that the children they help create may be sold away before they can even learn their names. The system pits survival against morality, making resistance almost impossible without risking death. Many men speak later of a numbness that settled in, a hard shell built to contain grief and rage. Yet that numbness is not the whole story. Enslaved men found ways to resist the stud role even when outward defiance meant a beating or worse. Some feigned illness or exhaustion, hoping to be deemed less valuable for breeding. Others subtly sabotaged the overseer's timetable, delaying work, disappearing for a night, or quietly helping women who sought to avoid pregnancy. These acts might seem small, but each was a calculated refusal to let their bodies be reduced to breeding stock. The psychological toll of this system was immense. Oral histories collected in the 1930s reveal men who still carried the wounds decades later. They described the humiliation of being treated like animals, the rage of watching their partners and children sold. Many struggled with a lasting sense of guilt. Guilt for the children they could not protect, for the women they could not shield, for the times they followed orders to avoid the lash. These feelings echo the trauma recognized today in survivors of assault and war. Still, within this brutal landscape, moments of courage flared. Some men plotted escapes despite the near certainty of capture. A few succeeded, using the dense forests, river routes, and the clandestine network, later called the Underground Railroad. Men who fled often risked everything to return for loved ones. Stories survive of fathers who doubled back to free wives or children, or who sent coded messages so their families might join them later. These rare triumphs became legends whispered from cabin to cabin, proof that the system was not invincible. There were subtler rebellions too. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, wagon drivers, sometimes sabotaged the very machinery of enslavement. A broken wheel on a trader's wagon might delay a sale long enough for an escape attempt. A faulty lock might give a captive a chance to slip away. These acts demanded careful planning and immense courage, for discovery could mean torture or death. Spiritual life offered another refuge. In clandestine gatherings, hush harbors hidden in the woods, men sang hymns that doubled as maps and messages. Biblical stories of Moses leading his people to freedom became coded calls for liberation. Here, men could reclaim their dignity, affirming their worth before a higher power, even as earthly masters tried to strip it away. The communal prayers, the shared songs, gave strength to endure and for some the courage to rebel. Consider again Isaac, our imagined figure. By day he labors, by night he carries the memory of his mother's teachings and the quiet pact with fellow men to protect the children as best they can, to share knowledge of escape routes, to keep alive the idea that they are more than property. Perhaps he dreams of flight, of a North Star and cold rivers that wash away the master's claim. Perhaps he simply endures so that one child, any child, might see freedom. The breeding farms sought to turn men into instruments, to twist fatherhood into a transaction and masculinity into a commodity. But they never fully succeeded. Each act of sabotage, each whispered plan, each prayer beneath the trees testified to a truth the enslavers could not erase. These men were human beings, capable of love, grief, and defiance. Their stories, often overshadowed by the more visible suffering of women and children, reveal the full scope of the system's cruelty and the resilience that met it. In remembering them, we honor not only their endurance, but their unbroken will to be more than the sum of their oppressors' calculations. Even as whips cracked and overseers barked orders hundreds of miles away, the true power behind the breeding farms often sat in polished offices lit by gas lamps. In those rooms, men in tailored coats inked signatures on ledgers that quietly transformed the bodies of enslaved people into figures of credit and return. The cruelty of the breeding system was physical, but its lifeblood flowed through money, and that money moved through the most respectable institutions of 19th century America. By the early 1800s, the United States had banned the transatlantic slave trade, yet the domestic trade exploded. Enslavers who once relied on ships from Africa now relied on reproduction at home. That meant an entire financial ecosystem emerged to monetize birth itself. Merchants and planters did not simply wait for children to grow. They calculated their worth years in advance. An infant girl born on a Virginia breeding farm represented a future asset, a human being whose expected sale price could be entered into a balance sheet before she could even walk. Banks were the first silent partners. Southern planters needed vast amounts of credit to buy land, seed, tools, and above all, enslaved people. Cotton was booming, but profits were seasonal. So lenders from New York, Boston, and London extended loans backed by what they called property, a euphemism for human lives. Ledgers from major institutions, some of which still exist today, list enslaved men, women, and children as collateral in the same columns as horses or acreage. A healthy woman of childbearing age carried special value because she promised not only labor but future births. To a banker, every pregnancy was a compounding investment. Insurance companies followed. Death during forced labor or childbirth threatened a planter's bottom line, so policies were written to compensate owners for losses. Firms based in northern cities like Hartford, Providence, and New York sold coverage that treated enslaved people like cargo, assigning premiums according to age, strength, and reproductive potential. In rare surviving documents, underwriters even discussed breeding capacity as a factor in pricing. Cold mathematics that reduced motherhood to a line item. Investors far removed from the plantations reaped dividends as well. Shares in southern railroads, shipping lines, and textile mills were underpinned by the cotton empire, which in turn depended on the expanding population of the enslaved. Northern textile magnates purchased that cotton, their profits reinforcing demand for the very human reproduction happening hundreds of miles south. Money from Boston, Philadelphia, and Liverpool coursed back into the system, financing more land purchases, more loans, more lives counted in dollars. Consider the auction block in Richmond, Virginia, one of the busiest slave markets in America. On sale days, the air buzzed not only with the cries of the enslaved, but with the chatter of brokers quoting interest rates and future prices of cotton. Traders spoke of prime field hands and breeding women as assets, their value rising or falling with market demand. A young woman who had borne several children might be advertised as proven, a word meant to reassure buyers of steady profits. Such advertisements were not fringe. They appeared in mainstream newspapers read by bankers and merchants across the nation. Politicians played their part, ensuring that laws protected creditors and maintained the illusion of legitimacy. Courts routinely enforced contracts where enslaved people were listed as collateral. When a planter defaulted, sheriffs seized families and sold them to satisfy debts, often tearing apart husbands, wives, and children. In this way, the financial system did more than enable slavery. It mechanized family separation, converting personal tragedy into routine bookkeeping. The breeding farms themselves became, in effect, production facilities feeding this network. Owners kept meticulous records: birth dates, parentage, projected market value. Some hired physicians to monitor women's health not out of compassion, but to maximize fertility. These records moved from plantation safes to bank vaults, where they served as evidence of future income. Human gestation was treated like an interest-bearing bond. Northern complicity cannot be overstated. While abolitionist voices grew louder, many respected businessmen quietly invested in Southern bonds or insured plantations. Profits from slave-backed securities flowed into universities, shipping companies, and civic projects. A factory owner in Rhode Island might never witness a whipping, but his fortune swelled with each child born into bondage hundreds of miles away. For the men and women on the ground, this invisible machinery tightened the chains. When a mother considered fleeing, she knew her children were already entered in a bank's ledger. When a father planned escape, he understood that his very body was collateral for someone else's loan. Freedom was not only a personal risk, it threatened the balance sheets of powerful strangers who had never laid eyes on them. Yet even within this bleak system, cracks formed. Financial panics, like the crash of 1837, shook markets and exposed the fragility of slave-backed credit. Abolitionists seized these moments to publish tracts revealing how Northern banks profited from human suffering. Formerly enslaved speakers toured cities, naming the institutions that insured their captors. Though profits remained high, the moral stain became harder to ignore. By the eve of the Civil War, billions of dollars in today's terms were tied to the forced reproduction of human beings. The breeding farms were not isolated horrors. They were integral to the national economy. Every bond sold, every policy underwritten, every loan approved added weight to the chains of men, women, and children who would never see a coin of the wealth they generated. Remember the men in those gas-lit offices, clerks tallying numbers, executives approving loans. They may never have set foot on a plantation, yet their pens deepened the suffering of countless lives. Behind every cry from a cabin, every birth forced by violence, there was a quiet scratch of a quill turning blood and grief into profit. The first cannon blast at Fort Sumter in April 1861 sent shockwaves through every cotton field and breeding farm in the South. What had once felt like an unshakable system, built on forced births and meticulously kept ledgers, suddenly trembled. The Civil War was not only a clash of armies, it was an earthquake under the economic foundations of human bondage. For the men, women, and children trapped on breeding farms, the distant thunder of war sounded like both promise and peril. At first, little changed. In Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, overseers still called the dawn roll. Women still faced the invasive scrutiny of owners obsessed with pregnancies, and traders still whispered about prices. Planters insisted that the conflict would be brief, a mere spat that would soon be resolved. They doubled down on their investments, pushing for more births to replace any enslaved men drafted or lost. But the front lines crept closer, and the old routines began to fray. Union blockades strangled trade routes, sending cotton prices into wild swings and making the sale of enslaved people riskier. Traders who once carried human cargo between states now found rivers patrolled by Union gunboats. Some markets shut down entirely. Without easy access to buyers, the breeding farms lost their lifeline. A woman forced to carry a child in 1862 no longer represented guaranteed profit. She represented risk. The cold arithmetic of reproduction faltered when the future of slavery itself was uncertain. For the enslaved, rumors moved faster than armies. Whispers of Lincoln's paper, the Emancipation Proclamation, reached the cabins months before January 1st, 1863. Enslavers tried to suppress the news, threatening violence for anyone caught discussing freedom. But word spread along secret networks. Black sailors in Union service, itinerant preachers, even sympathetic peddlers carrying supplies. The knowledge that the Union now fought to end slavery in rebel states set hearts racing. For women forced into breeding, the proclamation was more than politics. It was the first real crack in the wall of control. Some families seized the moment. When Union troops approached, entire groups slipped into the night. Heading toward the sounds of distant gunfire they prayed belonged to liberators. Women carried infants across swamps and rivers. Fathers guided children through forests lit by the North Star. Stories abound of daring escapes, a mother in Mississippi who disguised herself and her children as part of a funeral procession. A father in coastal Virginia who swam a tidal river under musket fire to lead his family to Union lines. Each success was a defiance of years of enforced breeding and a blow to the market that had commodified their bodies. Yet freedom's arrival was uneven and often brutal. In border states like Kentucky and Maryland, still loyal to the Union, slavery remained legal until the 13th Amendment. Breeding operations there continued even as the war raged. Some owners moved enslaved families westward, deeper into Confederate territory, to keep them beyond the reach of advancing Union troops. These forced migrations tore apart countless households. Children vanished into hastily organized caravans, sold or relocated before their parents could act. The chaos of war also brought new dangers. Raiding cavalry units, both Union and Confederate, sometimes swept through plantations, taking food, tools, or able-bodied workers. Enslaved people fleeing north risked capture by bounty hunters or re-enslavement under the Fugitive Slave Act, which remained law until the conflict's end. Freedom seekers faced starvation, exposure, and the constant threat of betrayal. For every triumphant escape, many more were recaptured or killed. Inside Union lines, the experience was complex. Refugee camps, called contraband camps, sprang up near army encampments. Families who had endured the breeding farms now struggled with disease, overcrowding, and hunger. Yet within these precarious sanctuaries, new lives began. Couples who had been torn apart reunited, sometimes after years of separation. Children born in the camps represented the first generation free from the calculated reproduction of slavery, even as their parents bore the scars of that system. The Confederate government, desperate for manpower, debated arming enslaved men in the war's final months. Some leaders hinted at offering freedom in exchange for service, an irony not lost on those forced to breed future generations of slaves. But the proposal came too late. By the time General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, the breeding farms lay in ruin. Fields overgrown, ledgers abandoned, profits lost to the tides of war. Still, the war's end did not mean instant safety or family reunification. Newly freed men and women embarked on perilous journeys to find loved ones sold away years before. They scoured newspapers for information wanted ads, traveled from town to town following faint leads, and relied on the kindness of strangers. Some found children they had never held, now grown. Others searched in vain, the trail cold, their families forever scattered. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, tried to help, recording marriages and mediating labor contracts. For women once forced to bear children as investments, these official marriages were acts of reclamation, a public declaration that their unions belonged to them, not to an owner's ledger. For men who had been coerced as studs, the chance to marry freely and protect their families offered a measure of healing. Even as poverty and prejudice persisted, economic aftershocks rippled through the nation. Southern banks collapsed under the weight of worthless slave-backed loans. Insurance companies quietly settled policies for enslavers who could no longer claim human property. Northern investors, once content to profit from breeding farms at a distance, distanced themselves from their involvement, rewriting histories to present their fortunes as clean. And yet, amid ruins and mourning, freedom's first breath was unmistakable. Formerly enslaved people built schools, churches, and businesses, asserting control over their bodies and their futures. Birth, once an instrument of oppression, became an act of self-determination. The children born in the early Reconstruction years carried a legacy of survival, descendants not of property, but of people who endured and resisted one of the most calculated atrocities in American history. The Civil War had shattered the breeding system, not only with bullets and bayonets, but by undermining the economic logic that sustained it. What began as a war to preserve a union ended as a war that destroyed a market built on forced reproduction. The echoes of that collapse would resound for generations. The war ended, but the wounds of the breeding farms did not heal with a single stroke of the pen. Emancipation granted legal freedom, yet the trauma of forced reproduction seeped into the next generations like a shadow that refused to lift. The legacy of those decades, when human birth was a financial strategy, still lives in family stories, in the gaps of missing ancestors, and in the very DNA of their descendants. In the first years after the Civil War, formerly enslaved families searched desperately for loved ones. They posted information wanted notices in black-owned newspapers, calling out names of children sold south, husbands vanished into distant plantations, wives lost in hurried auctions. Many found only silence. A mother might discover that her baby, born on a breeding farm and sold at age 2, had grown up under a different name hundreds of miles away. A father might learn that the woman he loved died before freedom ever came. These unanswered searches left scars that rippled through family trees. Entire branches missing, origins obscured by ledgers and false records. The psychological toll passed quietly from parent to child. Survivors carried memories of violation and coercion they often could not put into words. Some avoided speaking of the past altogether, believing silence the only protection. Yet that silence was itself a kind of inheritance. Grandchildren grew up sensing an unspoken grief, feeling a weight they could not name. Modern psychologists describe this as intergenerational trauma, emotional pain transmitted not only through stories, but through behavior, relationships, even biology. Science now gives that idea a tangible form. Genetic researchers studying the descendants of enslaved people find markers of stress, biological echoes of the constant fear and violence their ancestors endured. While genes themselves do not carry memories, trauma can influence how those genes are expressed, shaping vulnerability to anxiety, depression, and certain health conditions. The forced breeding of the 19th century left signatures in bodies alive today. The social legacy is just as profound. After emancipation, black families faced new systems designed to fracture them again. Convict leasing, sharecropping, and Jim Crow laws all worked to keep African Americans economically dependent and socially segregated. Lawmakers who once profited from breeding farms now wrote statutes that criminalized poverty, leading to mass arrests and forced labor. The names changed, but the core strategy, control black bodies for economic gain, remained. Family separation continued under different guises. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, courts routinely denied black parents custody of their own children if white employers or officials claimed neglect. During the Great Migration, when millions left the South seeking industrial jobs, poverty and discrimination broke households apart. In the 20th century, aggressive policing and discriminatory welfare policies intensified the cycle. Many scholars trace a direct line from the breeding farms to modern mass incarceration, where disproportionate imprisonment of black men again removes fathers from families and destabilizes communities. Cultural memory has struggled to keep pace with this history. For decades, mainstream textbooks glossed over or denied the existence of breeding farms. Students learned about cotton and tariffs, not forced reproduction. Descendants searching for their roots encountered burned courthouses, missing records, and euphemisms in plantation archives. A great-great-grandmother might be listed only as prime field hand or breeding woman, her real name lost. This erasure compounds the trauma, making the act of tracing lineage an act of resistance. Yet the past continues to surface. Genetic testing has helped some families reconnect, revealing distant cousins whose ancestors were sold across state lines. Oral historians record the stories of elders whose parents or grandparents were born in bondage. Archaeologists uncover unmarked graves near former breeding farms, giving the dead a measure of dignity and the living a sense of truth. Museums and memorials, from the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., now place the breeding system in plain view. The echoes appear even in everyday language. Phrases about good stock or raising strong boys carry unacknowledged roots in the era when human strength was a commodity. Conversations about reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, and medical racism all carry the resonance of a time when black women's fertility was controlled for profit. Modern disparities in maternal mortality, where black women die at far higher rates during childbirth, cannot be separated from a medical system shaped by centuries of exploitation. Descendants themselves often describe a complicated inheritance, pride in survival mingled with anger at the theft of their ancestors' choices. Some speak of feeling both haunted and empowered, aware that every breath they take is an act of defiance against a system that tried to reduce their forebears to numbers on a ledger. Their existence is living proof that the breeding farms failed in their ultimate goal of dehumanization. To confront this legacy is to confront America itself. The wealth generated by forced reproduction, built banks, funded railroads, and underwrote universities whose endowments still grow today. Acknowledging that truth is not about assigning personal guilt, but about recognizing collective responsibility. Reparative efforts, whether through public memorials, educational reforms, or economic investment in black communities, are steps toward addressing a debt measured not only in dollars but in generations of stolen lives. The trauma of the breeding farms is therefore not just a story of the past. It is present in the health disparities, the fractured families, the systemic racism that persists across housing, education, and the justice system. It is present in the quiet determination of descendants who search archives and DNA databases to reclaim their names. And it is present in the art, music, and literature that insist on remembering, refusing the erasure that the original system required. To speak of this legacy is to honor those who endured it. Each child born under compulsion, each parent separated by sale, each life counted as profit now speaks through the generations. Their bloodlines stretch across the nation, a living rebuke to the greed that sought to own them. They survived, and because they survived, the truth survives too. The journey ends where it began, in silence broken by memory. We have walked through shadowed cabins and counting houses, followed whispered rumors through wartime chaos, and listened to voices that refused to be erased. Now, standing in the present, we are left with the question that is echoed through every section of this story. What will we do with what we know? The breeding farms were not an aberration. They were a business plan carried out in broad daylight. Landowners, bankers, insurers, politicians, and distant investors all played their part. They turned conception into a commodity and reduced mothers, fathers, and children to numbers on a ledger. We have traced how that system collapsed in the fires of war but lived on in trauma, in fractured families, and in wealth that still shapes the American landscape. These truths demand more than passive acknowledgement. They demand remembrance. To remember is to name the people who were denied names in life. It is to seek out the unmarked graves, to read the faded advertisements that once called human beings prime stock, and to teach these facts in classrooms where history has too often been softened or ignored. Memory is not simply looking backward. It is an act of justice in the present. When we speak the names of those once counted as property, we refuse the erasure their oppressors intended. Education is the next step. For generations, textbooks glossed over forced breeding or omitted it entirely, leaving students to imagine slavery only as field labor and whips. But the reality is more complex and more human. Museums, local historical societies, and descendant-led projects are now piecing together this hidden history. Supporting their work, through visits, donations, or volunteer efforts, helps ensure that future generations learn the full story. Teachers who bring primary documents into classrooms, parents who share these truths at home, and artists who weave them into film, music, and literature all carry the torch of education forward. Justice is harder, yet essential. The wealth generated by breeding farms did not vanish with emancipation. It seeded banks, universities, and industries that thrive today. Acknowledging this fact opens conversations about reparative measures, investments in black communities, equitable policies in housing and education, and programs that address the health disparities rooted in centuries of exploitation. Justice can also be local and personal, advocating for memorials on former plantation grounds, pressing institutions to disclose their historical ties to slavery, and supporting descendants' efforts to reclaim land or family records. But justice also lives in the intimate work of healing. For descendants, uncovering this history can be both painful and liberating. Family reunions that cross state lines, DNA tests that reconnect distant cousins, oral histories recorded for future generations, all affirm that the people once reduced to breeding stock were and remain fully human. Their resilience becomes a source of strength. Each act of remembrance, each conversation about this painful past, chips away at the silence that once allowed such cruelty to flourish. As we close, consider the image of a child born today, laughing beneath an open sky. That child's freedom is the legacy of those who endured, resisted, and survived. Every breath of life they take is an answer to the system that tried to turn birth into bondage. We owe them more than gratitude. We owe them action. The disturbing truth about breeding farms is not a footnote to history. It is a mirror, showing how greed can warp morality and how ordinary people can be complicit in extraordinary evil. It is also a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. The men and women who lived through this nightmare carried forward love, culture, and hope. Their descendants walk among us, their blood a quiet defiance against the ledgers that once sought to define them. So let us remember, let us teach, let us work for a justice that honors their suffering and their strength. The story does not end here. It continues every time someone speaks the truth aloud, every time a forgotten name is found, every time we choose compassion over indifference. That is the call to action. That is the responsibility we inherit.